So all of our animals are free-range animals. That means that they're out in the range. They get to eat grass, they get to eat alfalfa, and then our producers bring out what is called a crib feeder. So essentially imagine a trough on wheels.
You know, we have so much evidence to show that cholesterol doesn't actually cause heart disease. That's not the problem here. There's an inflammatory process, and it actually has to do with hyperglycemia and different kinds of cholesterol molecules like VLDL and SDLDL that are derived from fructose and alcohol, not from meat. And that these then get glycated from the high blood sugar, and that your body can't suck these things up anymore because it's just damaged now. That's what glycation is what kills diabetics, having that high blood sugar. And so now your body can't suck these things up. Your liver can't process them. The only things that can pick these up are the scavenger receptors on your macrophages. And so your macrophages start picking these things up. They just eat them up, and they grow and grow and grow. They turn these massive foam cells. And during this whole inflammatory process, you start getting these atherosclerotic plaques. Okay, that's been well described in the literature. Okay, so it's not cholesterol, it's this entire disease process that is pushed and predicated on eating sugar, eating carbohydrates, drinking alcohol, okay? Smoking cigarettes. Oh, there's a ton of things that add to this, but just eating cholesterol is really not the driving factor here.
Cholesterol has many roles in the body, right? And one of them is thought to be in the immune system. And people with low levels of cholesterol, there is an association with cancer and with development of things like infections like pneumonia. So there's an issue there.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being back to Growth Factor. I'm Amalya. And the reason I do my show is there's many ways to grow mentally, spiritually, physically. And one of the things we can do that covers all that is give ourselves nutrients, the best for our bodies. And for me personally, I have to eat a lot of red meats. When I was vegan, I'm a nutritionist, I'm a hypnotherapist, and I raised my kids pretty much vegan. We were having gut issues, mental health issues. And in my view, for some of us, we can have a lot of anxiety not having the proper nutrients. And for me, instead of taking mental health pills, I just eat red meat, and that's my cure. So I'm so glad that Ilan Parenti is here. He's from Glatt Kosher Meats. He's a managing partner. And I just want to thank you for being here and let us know all about your meats, Ilan. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me on the program. Just as an introduction, Glatt Kosher Meats is a Glatt Kosher meat company. Our products can be found throughout the United States at every local Trader Joe's, select Costco stores in Jewish neighborhoods in particular, and other fine retailers throughout the United States. What makes, let's start with the name Teva. Teva itself in Hebrew means nature. And we thought that would be an appropriate name essentially because we do bring a natural product to the consumer. What we mean by natural, if you notice on meat packages, it's kind of sneaky. Many companies basically say natural meat, and then there's an asterisk next to it. And that's because of the USDA. The United States Department of Agriculture basically dictates what the word natural means. And if you follow that asterisk to the bottom of the package, it basically says minimally processed. What does that mean, minimally processed? By definition, USDA definition, it means that the meat itself is taken off the bone by the use of a knife. And obviously, that's how meat is cut. I like to tell people that we slaughter cattle, in our case, and prepare the meat almost like the cavemen used to, except we have fancier tools. The animal basically still gets slaughtered and gets taken apart by the use of a knife. We do have additional processes because we are a Glatt Kosher processor that we adhere to, but essentially nothing much has changed since really the caveman time. As far as going back to the name Teva itself and natural, what we mean by natural, our definition of natural is no antibiotics and no hormones in our meat. Now, how do animals consume antibiotics? How do they get antibiotics? Two methods, one more prevalent than the other. One is shots, which gets expensive, and the other one is through feed. So antibiotics are basically put into the animal's feed, the animal consumes it, and we now have a meat full of antibiotics, which would prevent, obviously, disease from that animal. Basically keeps the veterinarian away. We don't believe in that. We believe basically that animals should forage naturally, and animals that don't make the cut, in other words, do get sick, and animals do get sick, very much like us, those animals then are pulled out of our pool, and we don't get to slaughter that animal. That animal goes to someone else for processing, slaughter, etc. In addition to that, probably over 95% of animals are implanted with hormones. And the simple reason is we've commercialized essentially the growth of animals. And the way you do that is you implant hormones in the animal ear. That hormone is basically discharged on a regular basis. It keeps the animal hungry. And thus we can typically grow an animal within 24, 26 months, which is the age we harvest our animals at. And we now have a fatter animal, an animal that has eaten well and would grade well. Okay, so if I don't mean to throw the word grade out just like that. If you walk into your typical supermarket, Costco, etc., you'll notice that there's a shield on the wall, your local Walmart, and it says we sell choice USDA meats or prime meats, etc. Okay, so the animals actually, the carcass itself gets graded, okay, by an inspector as to the quality of the meat itself. Okay, marbling grade, size of the animal, many different criteria that basically come into play here. Let's talk about how we harvest our animals. The animals are shechted. Shechita basically is a reference to ritual slaughter. We have a group of shochtim or slaughtermen who we bring from Israel to wherever we decide to slaughter. If it's in Uruguay or Argentina, we slaughter strictly Angus genetic cattle, and we'll discuss genetics in animals and what that means from a quality standpoint. These rabbis come out, hardworking folks. They typically get to leave their family for 5-6 weeks at a time, go to a foreign land, and we start our day early. We start our day around 2:30 in the morning, and the simple reason for that is we try and avoid the animals standing around during midday when the sun is out. We just don't want those animals to suffer the heat. So we start our day early. By 10 a.m., we're typically done with our task for that day, and we retire back to our living quarters where we sit, study, eat, daven, pray, and get ready for the following day. The shechita process itself or slaughter process itself is beautiful to see. I know it sounds crazy. Most people relate to, my gosh, you take a knife and you cut an animal's throat and blood comes gushing out, and the visual basically is not beautiful. However, when it's done professionally and when it's done properly, that animal is typically out within 17 seconds and has felt nothing. That knife has to be of a certain size, a certain width, etc. There are rules as to how that animal gets slaughtered. There should be no hesitation in the slaughter process itself. After each animal is slaughtered, the chalofen, which is what the knife is called, is checked for any type of imperfections. And the only thing I can explain to people, what does that mean, imperfections on a knife? Have you ever licked an envelope and cut yourself? You get a paper cut. And you really don't feel that cut till after something enters that cut. If it's sweat or anything else, that's when you actually feel the pain that you've cut yourself. And then you look at the blood. In the case of that animal, we essentially have cut the trachea and the esophagus. In addition to that cut, there are veins essentially that are also cut in the process. And that animal essentially has been desensitized. And we hoist that animal at that point and start what we call the dress process, the removal of the hide, the internal organs, etc. That animal then goes down the line. After it's split, the carcass is split. So now you have two sides of beef. Those two sides of beef get graded, weighed, etc., and then goes into a cooler. Now, between the shechita and that cooler, we do a lot of work. Okay, that's what basically kosher means. So, what qualifies an animal as a kosher animal versus an animal that doesn't go kosher? And mind you, just as a simple mathematics, let's take a round number of 100. If we slaughter 100 animals, out of those 100 animals, typically only 50% of those animals qualify for kosher. What happens to the other 50%? They get simply sold into the non-kosher market. Now, of that 50%, 50 animals that have gone kosher, what do we look for in that animal? First of all, an animal has to be able to come into the kill box on its own. It cannot be limping. It cannot have any type of bruises, etc., which would disqualify it from kosher slaughter. That animal then is shechted or slaughtered. It goes down the line, and at a point where it's eviscerated, where the guts are pulled out of the animal, we have a bodek, an individual, another rabbi, whose job is to basically do a blind inspection. We call him the bodek pnim. Bodek means checker. Pnim means internal. So imagine essentially you basically put your arm into a dark cavity and you're looking essentially for any adhesions between the lung and the chest cavity. What's the importance of that? We also have a bodek chutz. So the guy who's doing the blind inspection, first of all, is looking for adhesions which may be left after that lung is pulled out, may be left on the inside, which means we missed it. So his job is to basically mark the lung itself. Okay, he has a card, he marks where he might have felt something, and he puts that on the carcass. The carcass then goes into a next position where the lung-heart combination is removed, and that's handed to a second rabbi whose job is to check the lung when it's out of the animal. He then looks at the card that he's handed and he says, the other rabbi told me to check the lobe. I'm going to go to the lobe and take a look and see what he felt. Have you ever had a flat bicycle tire? You pull that tube out, and how do you check where that hole is? If it's not visually there, you basically inflate that tube and you stick it essentially in water and you look for the bubbles. You look for the escaping air. It's exactly what we do. The bodek chutz essentially will inflate the lung. So he has a pedal where he releases air into that lung. He then blows up that lung. And where that adhesion might be, he then hits a second pedal that has a shower head on it, quite literally. And that drops water on the lung. And he'll hold that water in his hand. And we'll see if that adhesion basically bubbles, if there's air coming out. If that lung is punctured in any way, shape, or form, we know that that animal, A, has been sick up to that point, and that animal does not qualify for kosher harvesting. That's at 50% of the animals that then don't qualify for kosher. Those are sold into the non-kosher market. The other 50% that do qualify obviously had to be slaughtered properly per Jewish law. By the way, shechita, kosher slaughter, is something that was given to us by Hashem. On top of that, however, Hashem didn't tell us what we needed to do. Those are mostly halacha or rabbinic laws that were verbally given to us and have been practiced for thousands of years. That animal then goes through the process, gets stamped as kosher, goes into a cooler, and at that time it gets chilled down. Okay, lots of science goes behind that, what temperature to chill the carcass at, simply because we don't want the meat shrinking, etc. So everything is really done properly. The following day, when that carcass is at a certain temperature, in our case, it has to basically be under 40 degrees, typically 38 degrees or so. The carcass comes out, and we then split that carcass into 2 quarters. Okay, so imagine you start out with 2 sides. Now you have 2 halves, and then those 2 halves get split. So now you have 4 quarters, but each side gets 2 quarters, what we call a forequarter and the hind quarter. And the forequarter meat itself, between the 12th and 13th rib forward towards the head, is what we use in the kosher world. The hind quarter meat, which some of you could, we'll refer to as the loin section, if you've heard of tenderloin, if you heard of strip loin, etc. Those are cuts of meat that are not permissible for us for Jewish consumption. Now, there is an exception, and we'll discuss that exception. However, for most Ashkenazi Jews in the United States, typically, if you walk into a retailer, you will be buying forequarter meat, not hind quarter meat. The forequarter itself then goes through a process that we call nikur, Nikkur. And nikur literally in Hebrew means removing forbidden fats from that forequarter. We'll discuss what those are. And removal of the gida nashe, which is the sciatic nerve, okay, which we don't get to because that's in the hind quarter of the animal itself. So we'll talk about all that. The word nikur itself basically means to dig, okay, or remove. And that's essentially what the menaker, the individual who does the nikur, do. That's what he does. He will then use a knife and pull certain veins, okay, off the forequarter, as well as remove certain fats that are not permissible for consumption. How to do it, where to do it, etc., is again written in a book called Shulchan Aruch. The book itself in detail explains what veins need to be removed. Then the remainder of the process is that forequarter goes into a large tub of water. And when I say large, it is a good 40 feet long and probably about 10 feet wide. Lots of water. It's a swimming pool, essentially, that has a line with forequarters hanging on it. And the meat basically will sit and move through that water, find its way around that line for 30 minutes. Everything is timed. After 30 minutes, it comes out, goes basically through a few additional feet where the water drips, and then large flake kosher salt is thrown on that forequarter. Okay, quite literally, we have 3-4 guys with a mashgiach, with a supervisor who stand there to make sure that every square inch of that forequarter gets covered with salt. Why do we salt our meats? The idea behind that is we are not allowed to eat blood, simply not permissible. So that salt's purpose is to essentially pull out any remaining blood in that meat. It sits on the meat for a period of an hour. and again, meanders its way on a line in a room. So that meat will basically find its way into now an automatic washing cabinet. That salt is rinsed off the meat. It then goes through 3 ritual dips, which are, again, halachically required. And it comes out of this soak and salt room, we call it, and goes again into a cooler. And the idea, again, is to have the water basically drip. And then that meat, that full quarter, is ready for further processing. Further processing means that we then take it into a room where we typically have about 115, 120 individuals, both men and women. And then they take apart this full quarter and cut individual primals from that full quarter. If it's something called a chuck or something called a rib or ribeye, different cuts of meat. Those cuts then are bagged, cryovac, obviously have a kosher insert put into the bag, goes to a packaging room where the bag is sealed, goes into a box. The box is then taped with a kosher tape, as well as stamped by a rabbi. And that box essentially is ready for shipping into our warehouse here in Los Angeles, California. Process of harvesting the meat, soak and salt process, packaging it, and getting it essentially into our facility in California, where we further process it into individual cuts. So if you walk into your local Trader Joe's, you'll find Glatt kosher teva ground beef, you'll find stew meat, you'll find ribeye steaks, you'll find a brisket for the holiday. And God willing, you'll enjoy our product.
When you're eating Glatt kosher, Glatt means smooth, which means the lungs are smooth, which means when you're eating kosher, you're not eating a sick animal. And if that animal was sick, any problems with the lungs, it goes in the non-kosher pile. So when you're eating non-kosher, you're potentially eating a sick animal. Did I say that right?
The answer is yes, but however, it doesn't disqualify the animal from human consumption. So it's very important to remember that. It's not like we pass the other 50% and get other people sick. It just doesn't cut our criteria, which was handed to us by Hashem thousands of years ago. So it's a question of religion.
And in terms of price, sometimes I've heard people say kosher meat is more expensive.
It is slightly more expensive, not always though. Kosher meat, as I described to you, the process itself, it's not just slaughter, break, pack, and off you go. As you could tell, there are checks. Our team consists of about 18 individuals. I can assure you that non-kosher doesn't require that. Our process basically includes supervision throughout the process. So after the animal is slaughtered, there's an individual after that on the line who checks to make sure that the cut was done properly, just because of the speed that we work at. There's an individual also who checks the stomach itself, make sure that the animal didn't consume any nails. Believe it or not, they'll eat nails, they'll eat metal essentially out in the field. And that product itself then will lodge itself into the animal's stomach and will put a hole in the stomach. It's something that we cannot consume. So we have a stomach checker. We have the rabbi up on top who checks that lung. We have another rabbi who checks the lung on the outside. We have the individual who stamps. We have the menaker. So yes, our process is quite a bit more expensive than non-kosher meats. However, the story that I can relate to, I should say, is I work in Los Angeles when I'm not overseas, and I like to pass by some of our retailers and see how they market our product. I happen to be at the Costco in Van Nuys just to do some personal shopping for some kosher products for myself. And I like to check our display there. So I walk up to the display. This is during COVID, by the way. And the upright freezer is propped open by a shopping cart, and there's a lady there who's filling her shopping cart with a ton of ground meat. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, she must be working at some restaurant or something, and she's buying it for the restaurateur. So I walked up cautiously and I said, is that stuff any good? I'm not going to tell her who I am. And she says to me, it's the best. So as she says it's the best, I look at her, happens to be a non-Jewish consumer, okay, who's at the store. So I said to her, what makes it good? She said two things. First of all, I love the product. Secondly, look at the price. I said, what do you mean look at the price? She says, look at the attributes of the meat. Antibiotic-free, hormone-free, Angus, and at $6.49 a pound, it's a full $1 cheaper than the non-kosher product. How do you go wrong? I said, thank you, have a good day, and moved on. But I thought it was really interesting. So yes, kosher meat is typically more expensive, but not always.
And where are the animals raised or from or live most of their life?
So the animals, it's a good question, actually. And it's a question that I'm asked often. Are these, feedlot animals? Are they free range animals, et cetera? And I think people have a tremendous misconception of how animals are raised. We obviously don't raise cattle in our living room, okay? Because most people ask me, do animals eat grass? Do your animals eat grass? Every animal eats grass, okay? The question that consumers need to ask a person like myself is your animal strictly grass-fed? Do you also feed it additional legumes, etc.? And yes, we tried doing strictly a grass-fed beef program. The meat itself is extremely lean, and typically American consumers specifically don't like that product. They expect a product that has a little bit more fat to it, and that fat essentially is introduced by feeding an animal perhaps carrots. Okay, keep in mind carrots. Drink carrot juice. Okay, what's in it? Tastes real sweet. Sure, carrots have a lot of sugar in it. So what happens to that sugar when we or an animal consumes it? It consumes the sugar. It says, okay, I need this much sugar to handle insulin, and the rest basically converts to fat. That's why when we all eat ice cream, we gain weight. Okay, same thing in the animal kingdom. So if you're feeding them carrots or you're feeding them corn, okay, again, fructose comes from corn. You'll see that in all sodas and most products that are produced. Okay, that animal also gets fat from eating that corn. That maíz, corn, will add essentially flavor to the meat and will also add fat. We call that marbling in the meat industry. And most consumers, yes, prefer a well-marbled piece of meat. What's ideal? It depends on your budget. The Japanese have a breed called Wagyu, okay, Kobe beef, actually, if it's from Japan. And that meat seemingly has more fat than meat. They love it. We Americans prefer our choice meats. Every animal is graded by a USDA inspector, and that inspector then will grade the quality of the meat based on multiple criteria: animal's age, how do we determine age? Through dentition records or bone ossification, the animal's weight, and obviously how well that ribeye is marbled. So lots of science goes into producing meat. I love the fact that consumer can just walk into a store, pull it off the shelf and say, wow, that was a good steak or that was a good burger. Okay. And I attribute all that to the consumer. My job is to procure the best animals and do the best job we can put forth for the consumer. But I have to tell you, it's you guys that make it all happen. Honestly, I think we do a darn good job at it. From the hundreds of thousands of packages that we sell yearly, I think I get 4 or 5 phone calls annually. And I hope and trust that other consumers do see that phone number and will call or do call when something is not to their liking. So all of our animals are free range animals. That means that they're out in the range. They get to eat grass, they get to eat alfalfa, and then our producers bring out what is called a crib feeder. So essentially imagine a trough on wheels. It gets wheeled into the field, and the animal can then freely approach this trough and eat to its heart content. What do we feed that animal? Again, depending on the region where that animal is raised, alfalfa, carrots, some feed potatoes, okay, corn silage. And when that animal basically is fed for X number of days, and every animal has what we call an RFID tag. So it's essentially a tag that tracks that animal from birth to slaughter. That farmer can then read that animal's tag and say, okay, he or she have been on feed for X number of days. Visually, they're where they need to be, and then they load them out and send them essentially to slaughter. The animals that we harvest are raised both in Uruguay and in Argentina. Why not the USA? We used to harvest in the USA. However, we had something called a drought in the USA, and a lot of the farmers could not keep their cattle on the ground simply because there wasn't any grass. So think about the prospect of you have no grass and you have these mama cows. These mama cows are basically a factory. They give birth to these calves. Now, a cow-calf guy, a guy who basically gives birth to calves and then markets these calves to feeders, who then feed these calves, fatten them for slaughter. So these cow-calf guys sent large chunk of their herd to slaughter. So in the past 3 years, we had what is called basically a shortage of cattle in this country. You killed mama cows, you didn't have calves, and this will be our cycle, growth cycle for beef is typically 2.5 to 3 years. We still haven't rebuilt our herd here in this country. So we're looking at another 2.5 to 3 years of beef shortages in the United States. So two factors: A, shortage in quantity; B, shortage in quality; and obviously an astronomical price increase in purchasing that beef. Most American beef plants process large number of cattle on an hourly basis. Doesn't fit really our criteria for kosher. Tremendous consolidation in our industry in this country. So we harvest them overseas at this point.
I want to ask you about flavor. I never noticed the difference in different brands of kosher meats, but I imagine it's like a fine wine. Some people say, I like this meat because of this flavor. Can you tell me about your flavor or how you get your flavoring? I know you mentioned carrots and corn, but I don't know if that's the answer, but can you tell us a little bit about your flavor?
Sure. So what some people in this country like, other folks around the world detest. It has to do with what you're used to. Most people prefer a fatter piece of meat simply because it's juicier when you cook it. My ideal, for me personally, my ideal burger is an 80-20 burger, meaning it's 80% lean, 20% fat. Okay, throw the two, make that burger nice, medium, and it's perfect every time. Every time. If you go now and take a 90-10, a 90% lean, 10% fat burger, not to my liking. Okay, just too dry for me. So flavor is up to the individual. As far as you are what you eat, absolutely the case. Absolutely the case. Animals who forage strictly on grasslands have a different flavor to it. Some will say it tastes like sage because that grassland basically has a lot of sage. Again, you have to know where that beef is sourced and how that animal is finished, meaning on grass, other legumes, what type of legumes, etc., and then decide what is your favorite or to your liking, I should say. We purchase or procure our animals in such a manner where all animals are somewhat equal as far as their feed or rations are concerned, and when we harvest them, thus ensuring that your experience is a consistent one.
Since there's different groups, Jewish groups around the world, some will eat different companies' meat and some won't. So I think it's called hashgacha. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Who will eat your meat, who won't, and why?
Sure. That's actually a very good question. There are different groups of Jewish people in this country, in the world. We market our product essentially in the United States, Panama, Canada, Mexico, etc. So we do have it typically in North America. Different groups essentially will buy our products. Certain groups will not buy our product. We have a team of rabbis that consists of different groups. We have Chabadniks, we have Satmar boys, we have Hasidei Bells, we have Hasidei Gul. So we employ a variety of shochtim and bodkim, and most people, most consumers in this country will actually partake in our product. So yeah, we do have Chabadniks who buy our product throughout the country. We have Hasidim who buy our product. We are under 2 certifications at Teva. One of them is Tfilah LeDavid under the Honorable Rabbi David Miller from Muncie, New York, the Chassid rabbi, as well as the OU, the Orthodox Union. And essentially, both certifications come out to our slaughter, and A, they have to approve of the team that we put together, and B, they check all the processes that we described earlier on in our conversation to make sure that they adhere to their standards.
When I buy your meat, I get confused with the label. It says lean and a certain percentage that you were talking about in terms of flavoring. Is that, I assumed, I'm sure not correctly, that you do something to the meat to take out fat or put in fat. So can you explain to me your labeling and what it means?
Sure. So typically we ride the line of consumers who want a lean product versus consumers who want a fatter product. Our ground beef is 85-15, and it says so on the package. Now, what does that mean to you as a consumer? It means basically USDA dictates that label, by the way, and it means that it's 85% lean, 15% fat. How do we get that mix? So when we grind, imagine basically a big bin, and I mean a big bin, 2,000 pounds, okay, of ground beef essentially. We have a machine that goes into that bin, takes a core from that bin, and then tests that meat for leanness, and will give us a readout. 85-15 means that it could go 2% in either direction. It could be 83% lean, or it could be 87% lean. Okay, we obviously shoot for that 85. How do we get to that 85? We basically take different muscles, because different muscles in the animal's structure have different fat content. Okay, very much like human beings. You know, we tend to put our fat, you know, in our stomach or certain areas first. And same thing goes for the animal itself. So certain muscles are fatter muscles, others are leaner muscles, and we get basically a combination of the two to make our grind.
I have 2 final questions. One has to do with ruminant. I think there's a lot of people that don't know the word ruminant, but my basic comment is I learned this actually from a very strong, healthy woman that has an Instagram and other social media called JJ Virgin. And what she typically says is you are what you eat. ate. You are what you eat ate. So when this animal is eating, we're potentially consuming that in the meat. But I think the difference in a ruminant animal, a kosher animal, they have 4 stomachs. So they're processing it out. So when I listen to people like Professor Don Layman, University of Illinois, who he's been teaching us about food for years, he's the one that actually said eggs are healthy when there was a trend that they weren't. So what he says is a cow can eat the leftovers from the cotton industry and still make a great product. So can you tell me a bit about ruminant meats and the stomach process and how that results in what we eat?
Sure. So why do we eat certain animals and we're not allowed to eat other animals? Let's go to ruminants. So specifically in Leviticus, Vaikra is the book in Hebrew. Leviticus 11 specifically states that the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, tell the Israelites, these are the animals you can eat. If an animal has hooves that are split into 2 parts, and if that animal also chews the cud, then you may eat the meat from that animal. Some animals chew the cud, but they don't have split hooves. Do not eat these animals. Camels, badgers, rabbits, animals like that are unclean for you. Other animals have hooves that are split into 2 parts, but they don't chew their cud. Don't eat these animals, such as pigs. They are unclean to you. Do not eat the meat from these animals. Don't even touch their dead bodies. They are unclean for you. So we are actually directed, instructed specifically by Hashem not to consume these animals. And it's true. These are the product of a ruminant animal. Okay, is permissible to us for a certain reason. Kashrut laws have to do, people believe that it's strictly religious. Yeah, for us as Jews, it's a religious factor. However, from a health standpoint itself, the process itself is amazing when you think about it. People wonder, why is it that you use salt on meats? What did your great-grandparents do? They didn't have a refrigerator. They couldn't store meat for a long period of time. What did they do? They basically took it, packed it in salt, okay, so they could cure it, and it lasts longer, essentially, okay? It has 2 components to it. A, it tenderized it, okay, and kept it, obviously, free of bacteria for a very long time. So some of the things that we do because we're instructed to do it for thousands of years, when you look at what people actually did because they didn't have refrigeration, etc. Perfect. In addition to that, there are also something called a chaya, an animal that is not a domesticated animal, such as deer, elk, etc. And those have different rules in the kosher world. Yes, they could be consumed. However, the deveining is different. They don't have what we call chalev, non-permissible fats. Okay, more of the animal itself can be consumed. If you look behind me, there's a big poster of bison. I started 30 years ago in this industry by slaughtering bison, and bison is safek be'ema, safek chaya. It's doubtful to be a bovine, doubtful to be a wild animal. In other words, it's not domesticated, but we are somewhat domesticating bison these days. So certain rules apply to that as well. So it's really interesting. It keeps things interesting in the kosher world.
I think my final question is related to just I used to be vegan. Like I said, I'm a nutritionist, hypnotherapist. I used to be vegan for different reasons. And I remember a few videos came out from PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And they tried to show that kosher slaughter is not humane. And you pretty much already answered that, but if you could just give a brief, anything you want to say about PETA in general and kosher slaughter.
So the only pita that I like is my pita with hummus. Okay, I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, that's good.
I have nothing against the people for ethical treatment of animals. That's exactly what we do. That's why we shecht animals and don't stun animals and don't gas animals. Okay, we actually do it in a very humane fashion. Now, could it be inhumane? Sure. If you have an unprofessional person who basically pulls the knife across the neck and does not hit their marks, okay, yes, you have an animal now that's bleeding and suffering, okay? It's obviously something that we completely avoid. That's why we have experienced shoftim. I don't know if that answers your question, but I find kosher slaughter to be the most humane methodology by which we can harvest animals.
Glatt. Since your meat is glatt, what does that mean again?
It means smooth, just like you indicated earlier on. Okay, we look for adhesions, pathology on that lung. Okay, and if that lung essentially doesn't have pathology and passes the criteria, it is now glatt kosher meat. So there are essentially several standards in kosher. You have stam kosher, which we don't produce as a company. Okay, that's your Hebrew National hot dog. You know, I personally do not consume that product. Okay, nor do the religious Jewish world. Then you have glatt kosher, and then you have what is called standard called Beit Yosef, which is a standard followed by Sephardic Jews, where the lung itself is completely smooth, never had an adhesion. Okay, and we do classify our cattle into both Beit Yosef as well as glatt.
Thank you, Ilan Parente from Teva Glatt Kosher Meats. I want to thank everyone for listening and really appreciate your time, Ilan. You cleared a lot up because I buy your meat probably every 3 days. And so this is really helpful to me. And I hope it was helpful to everybody who's listening.
Well, we appreciate your purchasing our product. Atzlacha. May everyone have a Shabbat Shalom.
The obsession or concern with heart disease started in 1920s and then built up certainly to the 1950s, 60s, 1970s. So the death rates from heart disease started to increase, and scientists and doctors were wondering what's going on, what's causing this. And by the way, it wasn't until at least the late 60s, early 70s where there was a broader, I mean, even later than that, an acceptance of the impact of smoking, because the tobacco industry were very good at suppressing information that allowed doctors and the public to understand that actually smoking was a big factor in that. So imagine doctors are trying to figure out what's going on. And then a number of studies were carried out. One of the most famous ones is called the Framingham Heart Study. And that started in 1948 in Framingham, Massachusetts in the United States, and followed up 5,000 people, you know, young and middle-aged, and over a 30-year period to try and work out what were risk factors for heart disease. And from Framingham, we figured out high blood pressure was a problem, type 2 diabetes, for example, and also high cholesterol. But the people in Framingham, where there was a development of high cholesterol associated with heart disease, was actually at the extreme end. We call this familial hyperlipidemia now, which affects about 1 in 250 people, and is a genetically very, very high levels of cholesterol. What they found in Framingham, though, which is interesting, is that people where there was very, very high levels of cholesterol, there was a strong association with heart disease, premature heart disease. Right. But also people at the very lower end didn't tend to get heart disease. So people with genetically very low cholesterol, which is only about 5% of the population. But for the overwhelming majority of people, it wasn't a useful determinant. People with very low cholesterol, which is predominantly genetically determined, by the way, didn't develop heart disease. Therefore, lowering it must be the solution. And then lots of trials and drug trials and dietary trials started taking place, and it became almost a gospel truth without that definitive answer that would lowering cholesterol make any difference. We fast forward to where we are now, and I actually co-authored a paper a couple of years ago in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine with 2 cardiologists, where we decided let's look at all of the drug trials, industry-sponsored trials, to see whether there was any clear correlation with lowering cholesterol in both people at low risk of heart disease and high risk with preventing heart attacks and strokes. There was none. If you look at people with FH as well, with genetically very high levels of cholesterol, so this would be an LDL of at least 4.9 millimoles per litre. Okay,
and LDL, just to explain,
is a so-called bad cholesterol, okay, low-density lipoprotein.
Yeah.
But it isn't that bad, as people think, because certainly cholesterol has many roles in the body, right? And one of them is thought to be in the immune system. And people with low levels of cholesterol, there is an association with cancer and with development of things like infections like pneumonia. So there's an issue there. Even people with familial hyperlipidemia, who tend to be more at risk of developing heart disease prematurely, even when you look at those patients, the ones that develop heart disease versus the ones that don't, because many of them actually live normal, healthy lives without treatment, even though their cholesterols are through the roof and don't get heart disease, there's no difference between the LDL levels in the people with heart disease and the people that got it and people that didn't, which suggests there's something else going on. And we think that the people that tend to develop heart disease are people who may have something else in the blood with abnormal clotting factors, for example. So this is what we're trying to change the understanding, so we can be more precise in treating the right patient with the right drug at the right time, or the diet or the lifestyle intervention.